Sometimes, the smallest voices notice the emptiest hearts before anyone else does. You look lonely too, the little girl said with the quiet certainty only a child could carry, and for the first time in years, Daniel Carter found himself searching for words that simply were not there. The city glittered behind him in ribbons of gold and silver as guests in tailored tuxedos and elegant evening gowns drifted out of the historic concert hall, laughing beneath strings of winter lights that stretched across the avenue. Cameras flashed. Chauffeurs opened polished black car doors. Somewhere nearby, a jazz quartet still played the final notes of the charity gala Daniel himself had funded. Every headline tomorrow would praise his generosity, his vision, his remarkable success. They would call him one of America's most respected billionaires, a man who had built an empire from little more than determination and relentless discipline. They would never mention that he dreaded returning home every single night. Daniel adjusted the collar of his charcoal overcoat as the December air brushed across his face. His driver waited only a few yards away beside a gleaming sedan, but Daniel hesitated at the top of the stone steps, watching strangers embrace before disappearing into the cold. Parents wrapped scarves around sleepy children. Couples laughed over shared umbrellas. Friends promised to meet again before Christmas. Everyone seemed to belong to someone. Everyone except him. 5 years had passed since silence had become the loudest sound in his life, and no amount of success had figured out how to silence it. That was when he noticed the little girl sitting alone near a planter decorated with evergreen branches and tiny white lights. She couldn't have been older than 7. Her blonde hair rested beneath a knitted cream-colored hat, and a faded blue coat hung just a little too large around her shoulders. Resting carefully on her lap was a weathered wooden music box with tiny carved snowflakes around its edges. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking anyone for money. She simply watched people leave with a thoughtful expression that seemed strangely out of place on such a young face. Daniel almost continued walking. Years of business had trained him to keep moving, to solve only the problems that belonged on his calendar. But just as he passed, she looked up with bright blue eyes that reflected the holiday lights like little stars. "You look lonely too," she said softly. The words landed with impossible precision. Not because they were loud. Because they were true. Daniel stopped without realizing it. The city noise faded into the distance. Even the music from inside the theater seemed to disappear. He looked around, almost expecting the child to be speaking to someone else. She wasn't. Her eyes never left his face. "Excuse me," he managed at last. She tilted her head ever so slightly. "Everybody else left smiling with someone," she replied. "You walked out looking like you forgot something you can't buy." Daniel felt an unfamiliar ache tighten quietly beneath his ribs. Board members challenged him. Reporters questioned him. Competitors underestimated him. None of them had ever unsettled him the way one little sentence from a child had. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Snow began drifting gently through the glow of the streetlights, settling across the city without a sound. Daniel glanced toward his waiting driver, then back at the little girl with the music box resting carefully in her lap. Something inside him, something he had spent years locking behind carefully built walls of routine, success, and polished confidence, shifted ever so slightly. And although he did not know her name, he already sensed that walking away would be far more difficult than stopping had ever been. Sophie lowered her eyes for a moment as though she had accidentally shared a secret that grown-ups usually worked very hard to hide. Daniel remained still, his hand resting inside the pocket of his overcoat where his fingers absent-mindedly touched the old silver pocket watch his father had once carried every day. He had not looked at the watch in months, yet somehow the little girl's words had made him reach for it without thinking. "What makes you think that?" he finally asked, his voice quieter than before. Sophie offered a tiny shrug. "People who are happy look around because they want to remember things. You were looking everywhere except at the lights." Daniel could not help following her gaze toward the rows of glowing decorations stretched across the avenue. Children laughed as they chased one another through patches of fresh snow. Street musicians filled the cold evening with familiar Christmas songs. The entire city seemed wrapped in warmth that somehow never reached him. His driver stepped forward respectfully. "Sir, the car is ready whenever you are." Daniel nodded without taking his eyes off Sophie. "Give me a few more minutes." The driver quietly returned to the sedan without another word. Sophie gently brushed a few snowflakes from the wooden music box resting on her lap as if it were something precious enough to deserve its own care. Daniel noticed tiny scratches along its edges and a faded brass key on the side that had clearly been turned thousands of times. "That is a beautiful music box," he said. Her face brightened with a smile so small that it almost disappeared before it fully arrived. "It still works," she answered. "Sometimes." She carefully wound the little key. For a second nothing happened. Then a soft melody drifted into the winter air, delicate and slightly uneven, as though time itself had become part of the song. Daniel recognized the tune immediately. His mother had hummed the same lullaby when he was a boy. The memory appeared so suddenly that it caught him completely off guard. He had not thought about that song in decades. He could almost picture the small kitchen in the house where he grew up, the smell of cinnamon, the sound of laughter that once seemed ordinary until life quietly carried it away. The melody ended with a gentle click. Sophie looked almost embarrassed. "It skips near the end now," she whispered. "But I still like listening to it because quiet feels bigger when the music stops." Daniel slowly sat beside her on the cold stone planter, ignoring the expensive fabric of his coat against the melting snow. For the first time in years, he chose not to check the time, not to glance at his phone, not to think about tomorrow's meetings waiting on his calendar. He simply sat beside a child who seemed to understand silence better than most adults ever would. After a long pause he asked, "Are you waiting for someone?" Sophie smiled politely, but her eyes wandered toward the nearly empty sidewalk. "I was," she answered softly. "But sometimes people get busy." Daniel followed her gaze, watching families disappear into the glowing streets one by one. The city continued moving exactly as it always had, yet something inside him had begun moving for the first time in a very long while, and he could not explain why a conversation with a little girl carrying an old music box suddenly felt more important than every speech he had given that entire evening. Sophie closed the lid of the music box with both hands, almost as though she was protecting the last note from drifting away into the cold night. Daniel noticed the careful way she handled it. Children usually tossed their favorite things into backpacks or carried them carelessly beneath one arm. Sophie treated this tiny wooden box as though it carried something much heavier than music. A gentle breeze swept another wave of snow across the sidewalk, and the crowd outside the theater grew thinner with every passing minute. Holiday lights shimmered against the glass buildings, reflecting in the wet pavement like tiny stars scattered beneath their feet. Daniel glanced toward the avenue once more before looking back at Sophie. "Have you had dinner?" he asked. She thought for a moment before answering honestly. "Not yet. I was hoping my aunt would come before everything closed." Her voice remained calm, without complaint or disappointment. It sounded less like a child waiting for someone and more like someone who had already learned that plans sometimes changed without warning. Daniel hesitated. For years he had built invisible boundaries around every part of his life. His calendar decided who received his time. His assistants decided who reached his office. Even charity had become something scheduled between meetings. Yet nothing about this evening had followed a schedule. "There is a diner a few blocks away," he said carefully. "They make excellent apple pie. Would you like to join?" "Me?" Sophie studied his face for several seconds before smiling. "Only if you were already planning to eat." Daniel almost laughed. "Why does that matter?" She shrugged. "I do not want anyone feeling sorry for me. Eating with someone is nicer when they are hungry too." The simplicity of her answer caught him completely off guard. Most people who approached Daniel wanted introductions, investments, photographs, or favors. This little girl wanted something entirely different. She wanted company that felt genuine. Daniel slowly rose from the planter and offered his hand, not because she needed help standing, but because it felt like the natural thing to do. Sophie stood on her own first, then slipped the music box beneath one arm before placing her small gloved hand lightly in his. They began walking together beneath the glowing lights while his driver quietly followed several yards behind without interrupting them. The city felt strangely different now. Daniel noticed details he had ignored for years. The smell of roasted chestnuts from a street cart. The laughter spilling from a bookstore hosting a holiday reading. A young couple stopping to admire the decorated windows of an old bakery. Life had continued surrounding him all along, yet he had spent years looking straight through it. As they reached the corner, Sophie paused beside a toy store window where a small mechanical train circled a snowy village. She smiled warmly at the display but made no request to go inside. Daniel watched her reflection in the glass. It was not the toys that held her attention. It was the tiny houses glowing with yellow light. "They look warm," she whispered. Daniel followed her eyes. For reasons he could not explain, the word warm lingered in his thoughts far longer than the train circling its little village. He suddenly realized that although his penthouse overlooked the entire city, he could not remember the last time it had actually felt like home. The little diner welcomed them with warm yellow lights that softened the sharp edges of the winter night. A tiny bell chimed as they stepped inside, and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee, cinnamon, and baked apples wrapped around them like an old memory waiting to be remembered. It was nothing like the elegant banquet Daniel had quietly left behind an hour earlier. There were no crystal chandeliers, no polished speeches, no photographers waiting for the perfect smile. Only a handful of families finishing dinner, a retired couple sharing a slice of cherry pie, and holiday music drifting gently from an old radio above the counter. Sophie looked around with quiet curiosity before choosing a booth beside the frosted window. She carefully placed the wooden music box next to her, making certain it rested safely against the wall. Daniel slid into the seat across from her and found himself smiling at the simple scene without even realizing it. A waitress approached with 2 menus and greeted them warmly. "Good evening. What can I get started for you?" Daniel glanced at Sophie. "You choose." Sophie looked down at the menu for a few thoughtful seconds before answering. "Could I have the grilled cheese sandwich with tomato soup, please?" Then she looked at Daniel with a gentle smile. "And 1 slice of apple pie for us to share, if that is all right." The waitress nodded and turned toward Daniel. "And for you, sir?" Daniel closed the menu. "The same." Sophie blinked in surprise. "Really?" Daniel chuckled softly. "It has been a very long time since I ordered something because it sounded comforting instead of impressive." As the waitress walked away, silence settled comfortably between them. It was not the awkward silence of strangers. It was the peaceful kind that did not demand to be filled. Snowflakes drifted outside the window while passing cars left ribbons of light across the wet streets. Daniel found himself watching them without the usual pressure to hurry somewhere else. "Do you come here often?" he asked. Sophie nodded. "Sometimes my mom brought me here after school." She smiled at the memory. She always said grilled cheese tastes better on cold days. Daniel noticed the way her smile lingered for only a moment before becoming quiet again, but there was warmth in her voice instead of sadness. He chose not to ask another question yet. Instead, he listened. When the meals arrived, steam curled gently from the bowls of tomato soup. Sophie folded her hands for just a moment before taking her first bite. Daniel copied her without thinking. The sandwich was simple, warm, and somehow more satisfying than the expensive dinner waiting untouched at the gala. Halfway through the meal, the apple pie arrived with 2 forks. Sophie gently pushed the larger slice toward Daniel. He smiled and pushed it back. I think we can share it exactly down the middle. She laughed softly. That sounds fair. They each took a bite at the same time, and for reasons Daniel could not explain, the pie tasted less like dessert and more like something he had been missing for years. Around them, conversations rose and fell naturally, coffee cups clinked against saucers, and the old radio played another familiar Christmas tune. Daniel looked across the table at the little girl whose kindness had never once made him feel like a billionaire. She spoke to him as though he were simply another person looking for a warm place to belong, and somewhere between the grilled cheese, the shared pie, and the quiet music filling the diner, he realized this was the first meal in years that had not felt lonely. Daniel rested his coffee cup on the table as the last crumbs of apple pie disappeared from their plates. Neither of them seemed eager to leave. Outside, the snowfall had become softer, wrapping the quiet streets in a blanket of white that reflected the glow of every storefront. Inside the diner, time felt slower, almost generous. The waitress refilled Daniel's coffee without asking and smiled kindly at Sophie before returning to the counter. Daniel noticed that the little girl had absent-mindedly traced tiny circles on the lid of her wooden music box while staring through the frosted window. Your mother must have loved that music box very much, he said gently. Sophie's fingers paused. She smiled, but this time there was a tenderness behind it that made Daniel understand he had reached a memory she carefully protected. It was her favorite, she answered softly. She used to wind it every night before bed. She said homes should always have a little music, even on the hardest days. Daniel listened without interrupting. Sophie slowly turned the brass key until the familiar melody filled the booth once again. The tune still skipped near the end, but somehow that made it sound even more precious. She gave it to me on my last birthday, Sophie continued. She told me that if I ever felt alone, I should play it because love does not disappear just because someone is not standing beside you anymore. Daniel lowered his eyes. Those words settled somewhere deep inside him, touching places he had spent years refusing to visit. Where is your mother now? He asked quietly. Sophie looked at the gently spinning figures inside the music box before answering. She passed away last spring after being sick for a long time. She spoke with remarkable calm, the kind that came from having repeated the truth enough times that the tears had slowly turned into memories. I miss her every day, but I still talk to her sometimes. I think she would like knowing I still remember all her songs. Daniel felt the silver pocket watch resting inside his coat once again. He thought of his own parents, of the laughter that had once filled a modest family kitchen, of the years he had traded warmth for endless meetings and empty victories. Who takes care of you now? He asked. Sophie looked toward the window before answering. I stay at a children's home nearby. My aunt tried for a while, but she said she could not take care of me anymore. Everyone there is kind, but it is different. She smiled gently. A shelter keeps you safe. A home remembers your favorite soup. Daniel did not know how a 7-year-old could describe loneliness with such quiet wisdom. She was not asking for sympathy. She was simply describing the difference between being looked after and truly belonging. Sophie glanced at the small houses decorating the holiday village across the street. I like watching windows with lights, she admitted. Every family makes their home look a little different. I always wonder what their traditions are. Daniel followed her gaze. He suddenly realized that his own penthouse had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city, yet not a single tradition waiting. Inside. No music. No shared meals. No one asking how his day had been. Only silence that echoed through rooms far too large for one person. As the music box played its final uneven note, Daniel quietly understood that two people could live in completely different worlds and still carry the very same emptiness, and for the first time he wondered whether loneliness was not measured by the size of a house, but by whether anyone inside was waiting for you to come home. When they finally stepped back outside, the city had grown quieter. Fresh snow softened the sidewalks, and the holiday lights reflected across the street like ribbons of gold stretched over white silk. Daniel offered to drive Sophie back, and after a brief hesitation she nodded with the same quiet trust that had surprised him all evening. The ride across town was peaceful. Neither of them felt the need to fill every moment with conversation. Sophie watched neighborhoods pass by through the window, occasionally pointing toward decorated porches or brightly lit Christmas trees. "I like that one," she whispered as they passed a small brick house with handmade wreaths hanging from every window. "It looks like somebody had fun decorating together." Daniel smiled. "You notice details most people miss." Sophie looked back at him. "Mom always said homes tell stories before anyone opens the front door." Those words lingered with Daniel all the way to the children's home. It was a modest brick building tucked beside a community park, its entrance decorated with paper snowflakes taped carefully across the windows. Nothing about it looked neglected. It was clean, welcoming, and filled with gentle light. Even so, Daniel immediately understood what Sophie had meant earlier. It was safe. It was kind. But it was not the place where her mother's songs had once filled the air. Before stepping out of the car, Sophie carefully picked up the music box. "Thank you for dinner," she said sincerely. "I forgot what it felt like to laugh for a little while." Daniel found himself answering without thinking. "I did too." Sophie smiled, then reached into the pocket of her coat and unfolded a small piece of paper. It was a drawing made with colored pencils. One side showed a little diner beneath falling snow. Two people sat inside sharing a slice of pie. Above them, she had drawn warm yellow lights. "I drew this while I was waiting outside the theater before you came over," she explained. "I always carry paper because sometimes I see places before they happen." Daniel looked at the picture for a long moment. "You drew us before we even met?" Sophie nodded with a shy smile. "Not exactly. I just hoped nobody would have to eat alone tonight." Daniel carefully folded the drawing and placed it inside the inner pocket of his coat beside his father's silver watch. Somehow the two objects already seemed to belong together. As Sophie climbed out of the car, she paused beside the open door. "Will you remember to eat grilled cheese again?" she asked. Daniel laughed quietly. "I think I will." "Good," she replied. "Some things are better when they become traditions." She disappeared through the front doors, turning once to wave before stepping inside. Daniel remained parked along the curb for several minutes after she was gone. He watched the warm glow spilling from the windows and imagined children finishing homework, reading stories, or preparing for bed. Then he looked upward toward the skyline where his own penthouse waited high above the city. For the first time in years, the thought of returning there did not bring relief. It brought an unexpected emptiness. When he finally arrived home later that night, the silence greeted him exactly as it always had. The television still waited untouched. The dining table still held only one place setting. The enormous windows still overlooked thousands of homes glowing with life below. Daniel slipped Sophie's drawing onto the kitchen counter, wound his father's silver pocket watch for the first time in months, and realized that somewhere between a simple grilled cheese sandwich, a shared slice of apple pie, and a little wooden music box, something inside his carefully ordered world had quietly begun to change. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm neither of them had planned. Every Saturday morning, if his schedule allowed, Daniel drove across town instead of heading to another board meeting or charity luncheon. He no longer needed his assistant to remind him where he was going. Somehow the route to the children's home had become easier to remember than the address of his own office. Sophie always greeted him with the same bright smile and the same weathered wooden music box tucked safely beneath her arm. Sometimes they visited the public library, where Sophie spent nearly an hour choosing books before carefully reading the first page of each one. Sometimes they wandered through the city park, watching ducks glide across the frozen pond while sipping hot chocolate from paper cups. Other afternoons they stopped at a neighborhood bakery where Sophie insisted that cinnamon rolls tasted better when they were shared. Daniel found himself laughing more often than he had in years. The people around him noticed the change long before he did. His executive assistant smiled when he arrived carrying a paper bag filled with fresh muffins instead of business reports. His employees quietly remarked that he now remembered birthdays, paused to ask about their families, and stayed to listen instead of rushing toward the next appointment. Even the security guard downstairs commented that Mr. Carter looked different lately, as though he had finally started sleeping well again. Daniel could not explain the change. Nothing about his company had become easier. The meetings were still demanding. The responsibilities remained enormous. Yet the weight he had carried for so many years no longer seemed quite as heavy. One snowy afternoon, Sophie asked if they could visit the little diner again. They ordered the same meal as before, grilled cheese sandwiches, tomato soup, and one slice of apple pie with 2 forks. When the waitress recognized them, she smiled warmly and said, "Looks like your tradition is becoming official." Sophie beamed. "I told him traditions are important." Daniel smiled back. "You were right." After lunch they walked slowly through a neighborhood decorated for Christmas. Families were hanging lights from porches while children built snowmen in front yards. Sophie stopped beside a mailbox, decorated with a large red bow. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." She looked thoughtfully at the snowy sidewalk before speaking. "When people lose someone they love, do they ever stop missing them?" Daniel took a slow breath. "I do not think they stop missing them. I think they slowly learn how to carry the love without letting the sadness carry them." Sophie nodded quietly. "That sounds like my mom." Daniel looked at her in surprise. "She used to say that memories should become windows instead of walls," Sophie continued. "Windows let light come through." Daniel felt those words settle beside the drawing in his pocket and the silver watch he now wound every morning. They were becoming part of him, quiet reminders that life was measured by moments, not accomplishments. As they returned to the children's home that evening, Sophie handed him a folded piece of paper. It was another colored pencil drawing. This time she had sketched a tall apartment building with every window dark except one glowing warmly near the top. Beside it stood a small house surrounded by snow. A path connected the 2 buildings. "What is this?" Daniel asked. Sophie smiled gently. "Sometimes people think they have to find a new home," she said. "Maybe they just need someone willing to walk the path with them." Daniel carefully folded the drawing and placed it beside the first one, unaware that before Christmas arrived, that simple path would be tested in a way neither of them could have imagined. Christmas arrived wrapped in quiet snowfall, but Daniel found himself paying far less attention to the celebration waiting inside his company than to the visit he had promised Sophie that afternoon. For the first time in years, he ended the annual holiday gathering before the speeches were finished. His executives exchanged surprised glances as he slipped on his overcoat, tucked the silver pocket watch into its usual place, carefully folded Sophie's latest drawing into the inside pocket beside it, and left the ballroom carrying a small paper bag from the neighborhood bakery. Inside were 2 cinnamon rolls, still warm, because Sophie had once said they tasted best when shared. When Daniel reached the children's home, however, something immediately felt different. The front entrance remained decorated with paper snowflakes, but several cars were parked outside, and volunteers carried neatly packed boxes through the lobby. The director welcomed Daniel with a grateful smile that carried an unmistakable hint of concern. "I am glad you came," she said quietly. "There has been a change." Daniel felt his heart tighten. "Is Sophie all right?" "She is safe," the director assured him. "But another family has expressed interest in welcoming her into their home. They are scheduled to meet her after Christmas." Daniel stood silently, unsure why the words felt so much heavier than they should have. Was this not exactly what every child deserved, a family willing to open its doors? Yet the thought of never hearing Sophie's observations, never sharing another slice of apple pie, never watching her wind the little music box somehow left an ache he could not explain. Sophie appeared at the end of the hallway carrying the familiar wooden music box against her coat. Her smile arrived as soon as she saw him, but Daniel noticed that it carried the same thoughtful quietness she often wore when she was trying to protect someone else's feelings. "You came," she said. "I promised I would," Daniel answered. They walked together into the community room where a tall Christmas tree filled one corner with soft white lights. Children laughed nearby while decorating gingerbread cookies, yet Sophie quietly chose 2 chairs beside the window overlooking the snowy park. Daniel handed her the bakery bag. Her face brightened immediately. "You remembered." "Traditions are important," he replied with a smile. They shared the cinnamon rolls slowly while watching snowflakes drift beyond the glass. After several minutes, Sophie rested the music box on her lap. "Miss Eleanor told you, did she not?" Daniel nodded. "She did." Sophie looked down at her hands. "Everyone keeps asking if I am excited." She paused before continuing. "I think I am. But I am also scared that if I leave, some of my favorite people might become memories instead of part of my life." Daniel looked toward the Christmas tree, searching for the right words. Finally he said, "The people who truly care about you do not disappear just because life changes. They find new ways to stay." Sophie slowly wound the brass key. The familiar melody floated gently through the room until it reached the same uneven note near the end. She smiled. "Maybe that is why I never fixed it," she whispered. "It reminds me that imperfect things can still become the songs we love the most." Daniel listened as the final note faded into the warmth of the room. In that quiet moment he understood something that no business deal, award, or achievement had ever taught him. Love was never measured by how tightly someone could be held. Sometimes it was measured by whether you were willing to keep showing up, even when you had no promise that tomorrow would look the way you hoped. Spring arrived quietly, carrying gentle rain instead of snow, and with it came a season neither Daniel nor Sophie could have imagined on that first winter evening outside the concert hall. The family who had planned to welcome Sophie into their home had accepted a job opportunity in another state and decided they could no longer continue the adoption process. Although everyone at the children's home felt disappointed, Sophie simply smiled with the same quiet grace she always carried. "Mom used to say that closed doors sometimes help us notice the right one," she whispered. During the months that followed, Daniel continued showing up exactly as he always had. Saturday breakfasts became Saturday breakfasts. Library visits became library visits. Shared slices of apple pie became something neither of them questioned anymore. There were no grand promises, no dramatic speeches, only the steady rhythm of someone choosing to stay. One afternoon, the director of the children's home invited Daniel into her office. She thanked him for the countless hours he had spent volunteering, reading with the children, repairing old shelves in the library, and simply being present. Then she looked at him with a knowing smile. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "children remember consistency far longer than perfection." Daniel sat quietly for several moments before asking the question that had slowly grown inside his heart over the past months. If Sophie wanted it too, what would it take for me to become her family? The months that followed were filled with conversations, paperwork, home visits, and careful preparation. Daniel approached every step with the same patience he had learned from Sophie. He even made a decision that surprised everyone around him. He sold the enormous penthouse overlooking the city and purchased a smaller house on a quiet tree-lined street where children rode bicycles after school and neighbors decorated their porches together each holiday. When friends asked why he would leave such an extraordinary home, Daniel simply smiled. "I was looking for a house," he said. "I finally realized I needed a home." On a bright autumn afternoon, Sophie walked through the front door carrying the familiar wooden music box beneath one arm. The first thing she noticed was not the fresh paint or the sunny kitchen. It was the dining table. 2 place settings waited beside a homemade apple pie cooling near the window. Soft music played quietly from a small speaker in the corner. Daniel reached into his pocket and placed the silver watch beside the music box. "I think your mother was right," he said. "Homes should always have a little music." Sophie carefully wound the brass key. The melody filled every room before reaching the same uneven note that had once sounded lonely. Somehow, inside this little house, even the missing note felt complete. A year later, they returned together to the stone steps outside the old concert hall where everything had begun. Winter lights shimmered once again across the avenue, and families hurried past carrying shopping bags and cups of hot chocolate. Sophie looked up at Daniel with the same thoughtful smile she had worn the night they first met. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Daniel laughed softly. "You always do." She tilted her head just as she had that snowy evening long ago. "Do you still look lonely?" Daniel looked around at the glowing city, then down at the little girl who had quietly become his daughter. He thought about the shared grilled cheese sandwiches, the apple pies, the drawings folded safely beside his father's silver watch, the little music box that still skipped one note, and the simple traditions that had slowly filled an empty life with warmth. He smiled, gently took Sophie's hand, and answered with complete certainty, "Not anymore." Because someone finally came home.